Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm Andy RC and today I'm going to be checking out the Emax Tinyhawk FREESTYLE. Emax seem to be knocking out models left, right and centre at the moment, and just when I think they have everything covered, they come up with this, which is essentially the main guts of the recently released 2S Tinyhawk S, with the motors beefed up and the protectors removed in place of a carbon fibre FREESTYLE frame. Now, the original Tinyhawk suits both experienced and beginner pilots, being able to fly indoors in tight spaces without the worry of the walls in your house getting brand new paintwork slashed by the propellers. But the original Tinyhawk is a perfect platform for beginners who might not have mastered flying quadcopters yet, and therefore the protectors offer a safety net against hurting themselves, people around them, or other people's property. So that's where the Tinyhawk FREESTYLE steps in. Once you feel competent with the original Tinyhawk, the training wheels have been removed and you are ready for the next step. And I'm actually glad they have done this, because the Tinyhawk is an awesome model to learn on, but it's quite a leap to go from that to a 3-inch or a 5-inch model. So if this is any good and you want to stick with the Emax brand, then this could be the model that I recommend next. But I haven't flown it yet, so let's take a look at what they have done. Starting off with the frame, and it's actually made of carbon fibre with a white veneer to resemble the original Tinyhawk. The arms are 2mm thick and have been cut in a way which looks unorthodox, but it's been done to give maximum strength, and there is absolutely no flex in the arms whatsoever. The bottom plate is a unibody, so if it does actually break, you will have to replace the entire thing. However, with the model's dry weight being just 50 grams, I'd be surprised to see it ever breaking. The bottom plate is slightly wider to accommodate the all-in-one board. However, it wouldn't be a FREESTYLE model without a top plate to mount the lipos. So, once again, that dry weight of 50 grams is pretty impressive, especially when you hear what is coming next. The motors are Emax's own 1103 7000 kV naked bottom brushless motor designed for a 2S lipo. This is a good choice because they are going to be swinging the Avan Rush 2.5-inch tri-blade props. So you don't want the kV to be too high, otherwise the motors would overheat. The props screw into the motors, which you do have to fit yourself, and unfortunately they have not given you a tool to do that, so make sure you have a 1.5mm hex driver or an Allen key handy. I like how they have gone for the tri-blade and done their own thing, because for me it's this which removes it from the toothpick class and brings it into what I've been calling for years a brushless micro. They say the guts are identical to the Tinyhawk S, even down to the camera, which can actually have its camera angle adjusted in the same way as the Tinyhawk S now can do. However, I'd remove the top plate in order to do this, seeing as I completely destroyed the tension-fitted camera in the original Tinyhawk's frame. The idea for keeping the components the same as the Tinyhawk S apparently has been done to make replacing parts easy because they already exist. However, there are a couple of changes that I've noticed. The Tinyhawk S has its motors connecting via JST connectors to the side of the all-in-one board. However, this board has the motors directly soldered to the board itself instead of using JST connectors. Now, the JST connectors are in the same place as the first Tinyhawk and not at the side. So either mine are like this just because it's an early release, or there is a slight difference with the board. They also have added a Rubicon 16 volt 100 microfarad capacitor to the battery terminals, which I think I questioned whether they should have done this in my Tinyhawk S review to smooth out any voltage spikes. Of course, if you do need to replace the board, then you can easily desolder the low ESR capacitor from this one and add it to a new board. And the capacitor is also wrapped around some heat shrink for extra protection, which is a nice touch. The board orientation has also been switched around compared to the original Tinyhawk, but of course this isn't a problem because when you buy into Emax they insist that you don't upgrade Betaflight due to them having a custom setup which will get wiped if you upgrade. Although if you check the Emax USA website you can usually download the CLI, but seeing as I've got no links or information at the making of this video, I'll just have to assume that they will be providing that, given that they are saying that the boards are interchangeable. The board orientation change does make it difficult to reach the bind button. However, you can use the SPI bind command in the CLI to combat that issue. Another change that they have made is the LiPo connector. As you can see, we have a circuit board with two PH2 connectors soldered back to back. Now, in my Tinyhawk S review, I recommended that for a 2S, an XT30 connector is probably the best way to go. However, Emax might have made a genius move here because, first of all, on the new model, the PH2 connectors have solid pins, whereas on the Tinyhawk S, it used open pins. Open pins basically mean that the connectors splay out just like on an XT30 or an XT60 connector, resulting in extra friction so that the LiPo doesn't unplug in the air. But there is a downside to this, especially when you scale it down, because as the open pins splay out, they aren't making full contact to the LiPo connector, which creates a resistance. And this resistance limits the current flow from the LiPo to the model, causing the LiPo's voltage to sag under a heavy load, which in turn damages the chemistry of the LiPo, but the model also loses performance because the RPM of the motors reduce from the lack of current and voltage. And that actually happened with the Emax Tinyhawk S. The PH2 connector used open pins, so when you used their 2S LiPo, the voltage sagged too much. So I actually brought some closed pin connectors to see if that would fix the issue, as well as considering adding an XT30 connector, but Emax are knocking these models out so quick I haven't had the time to do the test yet. So you might be thinking, why didn't they just add an XT30 connector? And I think the answer is simple. There are a lot of people who already have the original Tinyhawk and have probably bought loads of the 1S LiPos for it. So, while this new model can't run off a 1S, they provide two of the 450 milliamp high volt 1S LiPos with the PH2 connector, so that you can use your existing batteries with this one. I just hope that the closed pin solution is enough to maintain a stable voltage and current, and we'll be finding that out in this video. Another concern I have is that because the board hasn't changed, the ESCs are only rated to 5 amps each continuous. Now, if this was a toothpick running the 65mm dual blade, then I wouldn't be concerned, because I learnt from the current meter on the Gap RC Phantom that its max current draw was about 16 amps in total. But these props are pitch heavy tri-blades, so again, time will tell whether the ESCs can cope with these props or not. But this is Emax, so I'm feeling pretty confident. To install the batteries, you kind of have to awkwardly position the two LiPos on the top plate and then use the included single strap to hold them down. And I would like to have seen some kind of anti-slip material used to stop the LiPos from throwing in a crash, but you don't get that. And it's all up weight with the two LiPos is just 77 grams, which if everything goes to plan, then that is pretty impressive. The VTX is the same as the original Tinyhawk, so it outputs at 25 milliwatt, but this time it's got a much longer and thicker linear antenna, which is cable tied to one side. It gets pretty close to the prop, so I think they could have moved it more towards the middle, which I guess is an easy modification that we can all make. Just like all the other Tinyhawks, for Emax to cover themselves against regulations, the VTX is locked to 25 channels, including race band 1 to 3, and it also uses smart audio to change the channels via Betaflight's on-screen display. So, once again, don't get caught out by selecting a locked channel, otherwise it won't output anything, and you will need to unlock it by, well, first unplugging the battery and then pressing down the button on the VTX and then plugging in the battery and holding it for 5 seconds, and then that will unlock the VTX so that you can change it to another channel. The flight controller also has a built-in SPI receiver, the same as the Tinyhawk S, which is set to D8 mode out of the box. Again, this is a good call because D16 SPI receivers send telemetry back to your transmitter, and this seems to cause unwanted failsafes and dropouts. In D8 mode, you still get the RSSI feeding through to the on-screen display. Just make sure that it's set to disabled in the receiver tab as it feeds through automatically. The antenna for the built-in receiver has been left loose coming out of the back, which sends it too close to the props for my liking. So I've added my own cable tie and heat shrink to make sure that it doesn't get chopped up. The model has come flash with Betaflight version 4.04 with Matek F411RX as the target. There are spare UARTs if you want to add a non-FR-Sky receiver. The arm angle was set to 50 degrees, which I've changed to 180 just because that's the preference that I like. It also helps me to get the model out of a tree if I've disarmed and I can shake it out. I've also enabled RX lost in the D-Shot commands. RX set was already selected for a lost model alarm because this model has no physical beeper, but I also like to set RX lost in case I lose my transmission feed from my transmitter. It will still send out a beacon if the model has landed in long grass. The power and battery was set low, which is how I usually like to set it, although having not flown it yet, it's kind of sending out alarm bells regarding voltage sag, but I'll give it a benefit of doubt until I've flown it. I've not touched anything in the PID tuning page, however there is something to take note of. Just like the original Tinyhawk, the maximum tilt angle is set to 25 degrees, which means that when you are in angle mode, you will really have to push the sticks to the extreme in order to get the quad moving. Now, I know why they have done this, because usually the first thing a beginner does, not having flown a quadcopter before, is go heavy on the sticks. But with this being an outdoor model, if it's a windy day and the maximum angle you can tilt your quad at to get it back to yourself isn't enough to fight against the wind, then the wind will just carry it away. So for me, personally, I changed this figure to about 50. The only thing that I've touched in the receiver tab is the RC deadband. I usually set it to about 5 to stop any trim drift feeding through from my transmitter. Usually I would move the modes tab to suit my radio, but I'm going to leave them in the stock position and set my radio up to accommodate their positions just so that you can see the stock setup. Flip over after crash, aka turtle mode, is set up on the auxiliary 4, and on a model like this I wouldn't usually use it, because if you do crash upside down and it just so happens that one of the propellers has gotten caught around some grass and you try and flip it back over but the motor is resisting because it's caught up in some grass, then that can cause resistance to the ESC and cause the ESC to blow. But it is there if you want to use it, and it won't conflict with the RSSI, because the RSSI is all done through the SPI system, so there's no need to use the auxiliary 4 to have the RSSI feeding through to the on-screen display, so we are all good there. The on-screen display is set up just fine. The only thing I removed was the max speed on the end screen, as there's no GPS on this model. So also in the package you are given a Tinyhawk pouch, but sadly the model doesn't fit in with the props attached this time, which is something I loved with the original Tinyhawk, but I guess there's no way around that with them being 2.5-inch props. But with the original you could just throw it in your bag and go. You get a spare set of props, a USB charger which only charges to a high volt, along with a few spares, some Emax stickers and a small manual. Okay, let's go for a line of sight with this guy. It leaps into the air and I'm starting off in angle mode, and just like the original Tinyhawk, you have to be careful flying this guy outside in angle mode. You can see it stabilizes itself, but that is the full throw. So if it's a very windy day, then it could very well get away from yourself. But it's stabilizing itself fine. Then we should have horizon mode, and hopefully that will get rid of that limited angle. So there you go. And if we go up on the throttle and go to the edge of the stick, we can actually do a roll, or you can do a backflip, but it retains that stability even when it's windy like this. And then finally we've got acro mode, where I should be able to do all kinds of aerobatics. So this thing is just so quiet, it's difficult to hear over the noise of the wind, and that is one of the intentions they had with this model. So next let's try a punch out and see if I can hear any oscillations. Yeah, definitely some oscillations, which I did think I might see when I looked at the PIDs. I might find that when I fly this guy FPV, even though I'm hearing oscillations, it's going to be as smooth as anything on full throttle when doing those maneuvers. And for me personally, it doesn't sit well with me. I prefer not to have oscillations myself, and maybe it won't be as smooth at the top of the throttle, but that's just how I prefer it. And you know, that's what you get when you buy into Emax. You're buying someone else's setup and tune, and if you're not into it, then you know you're not into it. But you could probably either reduce that max D gain, or you could add in some TPA, that's throttle PID attenuation, and then that will reduce the PIDs as you go up on the throttle. I tend to try and not use that though as an option, because you tend to get a jerk when you all of a sudden come off the throttle. So I think, yeah, I'd be reducing that D-term max value just to get rid of those oscillations. Another thing that I've noticed as well is that when the quadcopter is on its side like this, the antenna for the VTX is getting almost completely blocked by the battery. Can you see there? And with this being just a 25 milliwatt VTX, I can see when I'm turning that way, especially as I'm going to be higher than this, that I may get more breakup when I'm in that direction than when I'm in this direction, because the antenna is free there. Get a long flight time with this guy, and that's another one of their intentions, to get really long flight time be inconspicuous and quiet. And I like it. I do like it. I'll do an FPV flight with it like this, just to see if it is smooth, because it's flying smooth. But I think once the review is done, I'll be lowering some of those values myself. They say not to, they say don't touch any of the settings, but there you go. Man, this thing is just gonna keep on flying. See if I can do a power loop with it. Yeah, no problem. It flies super actually. And you can barely hear those oscillations, by the way. And as the battery depletes, you actually don't get them. They go away. So it's actually the large amount of power that this thing has got that's causing the oscillations, and as the battery depletes, then they go away. But that is a fair amount of punch with this model, and a fair amount of flight time. I was gonna see if the LiPo would run out, but I don't think it's gonna, so let's bring it in for a landing and do some FPV with it. Just want to check the heat of the motors. They are absolutely stone cold. So let's take a look at some DVR footage, and as you can see, it's much later on in the day, and that is because, believe it or not, after the line of sight flight that I did, despite it being fairly sunny but very windy, it then proceeded to rain for the entire day. But there was an advantage to flying a little bit later on, because the wind completely died down and this thing is flying absolutely superb. And I know I say this in pretty much all of my Emax reviews, but this model has their signature super smooth flight characteristics. And even though I was getting those oscillations earlier, it's not showing in the flight footage. So, you know, you could say that it is tuned perfectly, but audibly, when you're flying at line of sight, you can hear oscillations. But just look at this, how nimble it is around the trees. And I was really impressed how it was flying. So we are just a minute in, and I've not seen the battery warning flash yet, so that's also a good sign. I'm trying to dive this tree here, but I'm failing because there's still a little bit of wind around, and also as well, this field of view on this camera is very wide, so I'm not used to that. Yeah, just making up excuses though. You'll notice that I'm keeping the model in fairly close, and that is because the RSSI value is reading in the low 30s for quite a lot of the time, so expect only about 100 meters of range out of this guy. And just as I suspected, when it does turn to the side, you do lose that reception, and I demonstrate that in a little while. But I'm just having too much fun flying this thing, and it flies for absolutely ages. So as you can see, I can do all my usual maneuvers that I do with a 5-inch. So you've got your inverted yaw spins, you've got the NDRC signature cartwheel, and look at that, we are just about 2 minutes in. I nailed the tree gap, but we did actually get a flash on the warning voltage. So these closed pins, they are working, but not quite there. And as you can see, as I go further away from myself, pointing in that left direction, the antenna for the VTX is completely blocked. So just as I suspected, it is affecting the range. So that perhaps needs moving. And from this point on, I think we will start to see the voltage warning flashing, but you'll see it recovers fairly quickly. So we're back to 7 volts, and I nailed the tree dive, so fairly happy with that. But yeah, I actually spoke to Emax after I did my review of the Tinyhawk S, and they said, yeah, go ahead, our engineers reckon that an XT30 will be fine on this system. So I can imagine if you haven't bought too many of these 1S LiPos and you've got a bunch of the 300 milliamp or the 450 milliamp GMB 2S LiPos with the XT30, then I think that would be a perfect match. I think you get less voltage sag and you would perhaps get more performance as well. So that's definitely an option with this model. But look at this, we're coming up to a 4-minute flight time, and we do have audio on this model as well. Of course it's picking up the breakup, but yeah, there's audio on this model if you are into that, but the breakup that it picks up is quite loud. But yeah, I'm just having so much fun with this, and you can see the voltage there. It is hanging around about 7 volts, and it drops off really quickly. Look at that, gone down to 5 there. I'm trying to get through the tree again, but there you go, it's starting to flash and it drops really quickly, so be careful. Okay guys, here's just a quick update. I've put my own tune on this guy because I wasn't happy with those oscillations, so let's go for a punch out now and see if we can hear anything. Smooth as anything, that's how you want it. And I didn't add any TPA. The culprit was mainly the P and the D value on the roll. And I also reduced the pitch slightly as well, I believe. But I will link in the description to my CLI dump. I don't think it's compromised how the model flies whatsoever. It's still as smooth as anything. We just no longer have oscillations. In fact, sometimes oscillations can slow a model down, but this thing now, smooth as anything, and it can just keep on going. That's got so much power. And there you go, that is my review of the Emax Tinyhawk Freestyle. I don't have any links or any information on pricing, but when I do, I will link it in the description. So as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.